Welcome back, class. I hope you enjoyed that discussion on polygenesis and monogenesis. We are moving swiftly through this lecture. Although that last part was a little bit longer than I would have anticipated. I was trying to cap at about 15 minutes. It turned out it was about 23, 24. But that's fine. As you no doubt can understand, these subjects are not exactly easy to talk about, and they're also not entirely clear. There's a lot of overlap. And since we are talking about scientific topics that are not exactly scientific, I'm trying to give you an explanation of how these sciences, air quote, sciences, developed, expanded, and even as they fell away, how they remained influential in our overall era. And so that brings us to social Darwinism, sort of the highlight topic of this week. And what social Darwinism essentially is a collection of ideas and theories that suggests that people can be people through naturally bred naturally bred people who are, let's just move to the, hang on here. This is better. Let's just do this. Individuals, groups, people, whoever, everything, but specifically applied to people, are all subject to Darwin's view of natural selection, adaptation, and evolution. Now, technically, people are subject to Darwin's theories of evolution, of natural selection, adaptation, and evolution. Darwin would not object to that aspect of it. However, in social Darwinism, and you got this from the video that you saw that discusses this matter, the one that was about Darwin specifically, social Darwinism tries to apply these structures to certain behavior, economic systems, the development of civilization, to explain the hierarchy of the world. And so they're not applying this strictly to biological development. They're trying to apply this to the sociological, psychological, and societal developments, things that are not really purview to Darwin's adaptation, natural selection, adaptation, and evolution. Darwin wasn't studying how finches flock together or how human beings form cities or why they form cities. He was merely trying to understand how certain groups of species can have variance and how certain variances fade away and others become the dominant. Social Darwinism, on the other hand, tries to explain, just like all the other ones, polygenesis and phrenology, how white Europeans come to dominate the globe. And they do this by incorporating some aspects of those other two, quote, sciences, but they also lean heavily on Darwin's theory of evolution and natural selection. But again, as I pointed out before, and forgive me for using the phrase, it is a bastardization of Darwin's view, because Darwin himself was not discussing these matters, and he was not alive to defend his work by the time that this became increasingly popular. So what we have here, excuse me while I drink. What we have here is a theory in which tries to explain how human civilization develops and evolves, how certain races and ethnicities become superior and dominant over others that would be considered lesser. And as you can see below that, that second to last point, it also incorporates individual and family lineage as well. So people who are wealthy and brilliant, creative, and successful, regardless of their race and regardless of their ethnicity. Of course, all of this is integrated into a pyramid in which the ones on top are naturally going to be white, the ones on bottom are going to be the darkest, and as you transcend the pyramid from bottom to top, they get lighter. Skin color and ethnicity becomes lighter and lighter and lighter, and more Western than Eastern. You have those exceptions, of course. For example, an African who might be brilliant at art and music might be considered the top of his or her race. Or maybe if it's, say, a former slave, somebody might argue that the only reason why they are able to achieve that is because they were under the guidance and tutelage of somebody like a master who could guide them properly and develop these attributes, even though the majority of their people don't have them. Again, that would be their view, because I think Duke Ellington would disagree, and a lot of famous poets and artists who are Black or Asian would disagree, but their view would be that only whites have this kind of superior culture and refinement that other civilizations and other races simply don't have. At the top of this pyramid, and I will show you a pyramid in a little bit, at the top of this pyramid is not simply the white race, but white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, otherwise known as WASPs. WASPs was one of our terms, and WASP stands for White Anglo-Saxon Protestant. Now, what is a White Anglo-Saxon Protestant? Well, it's fairly straightforward, but a White Anglo-Saxon Protestant is, one, white, two, they are of Anglo-Saxon ethnic origin, meaning Great Britain, Welsh, to a certain extent, the northern part of France, and Germanic or Teutonic. And one of the subgroups of the Teutonic race or the Teutonic ethnicity is Aryanism. Although Aryans are also found in India, which gets really dicey. It'll come up again during World War II with Hitler. But pure white Aryans, Teutonics, these would be part of the Normans. The Normans, if you know your medieval history, I had to help teach a class on it. It's not the easiest history to learn. But the Normans stretched out from, they were Germanic peoples. They stretched out from what is today Germany into northern France. And eventually the Normans invaded England and subjugated what became England, what would have been called Britannia under the Roman Empire. And they subjugated the native, how do I put this? The native island people that would have lived on Britain, very similar to the Welsh. They spoke, if you're familiar with Welsh, the Welsh language, look up, take a moment, pause the video and look up the Welsh language. It's technically part of English, but you can't read it because it's not really the same thing. It's like a Gaelic language. And if any of you have taken a literature class and maybe have read Beowulf and have seen the original writing of Beowulf, it's technically in English, but you couldn't read it because it's not the English that we have today. They subjugated those people and then integrated with them, but they became the ruling class. And the Saxons came and from Germany did the same thing. And thus we have the Anglo-Saxons. So the Anglo-Saxon people are a conquering people, and for our purposes, Anglo-Saxonism mainly refers to Germanic, Frankish, and British. And then by extension, those people, when they went to the United States, they became American, but they are still of Anglo-Saxon origin, and they are Protestant. So Protestantism is a big deal to these people. Catholicism, which was the dominant, and it actually still is the dominant religion in Europe, even at this time, is found in places like Italy, France, Spain. The Orthodox Catholic Church is found in Greece, and there's Russian Orthodox, there's Coptic Catholic. They all have bishops, and in the case of Roman Catholics, they align themselves with a central bishop known as the Pope. And the religion of Roman Catholicism is considered to be corrupt. It's considered to be a form of a dictatorship. It's not supposed to be democratic. So these people, these white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, not only consider their race to be superior and their ethnicity to be superior and their culture to be superior, but an extension of that is the fact that Protestants such as Calvinism, Congregationalism, Presbyterianism, Methodism, Lutheranism to a certain extent, and Anglicanism or Episcopalianism, kind of, sort of, they still have bishops, but they're considered to be superior because in theory, they don't align themselves to a central dictator in Rome. They are centered around Democratic or Republican principles. You can elect your own minister. The Bible is in your native language as opposed to being in Latin, which only the Pope and other priests can read. You don't have to go to confession and be forgiven by somebody else to avoid going to hell. There's a lot of things in here. I'm not going to go get really crazy into this, but essentially, white Anglo-Saxon Protestants see themselves as a cut above. Their culture is a cut above. Their race is a cut above. Their ethnicity, their religion, all of it is a cut above. And all of this is an expression of not only God's divine will, but also an expression of their racial creativity. That they may worship the same God as a Catholic, as a Roman Catholic, but they do it in a very uh, democratic and Republican sort of way, a way that is beneficial to all. People get a say, people get a vote. It's very American. It's very British. And that is all part of this. And I should go back and just reiterate something I know I've beaten like a dead horse, but I'm going to say it again. Remember that when a lot of these people classify themselves, they're going to take these attributes like Protestantism, like their race, like their music and their culture, and they're going to say that it is almost scientifically understood to be superior to everybody else. I'm not saying that it is, of course. And you might be wondering, well, how can they prove that? They really can't. They just pretty much say that, well, we rule the world, we have the most money, we have things like industry, we have things like this and that and the other. Therefore, X equals X, X plus this equals Y. It all adds up. Ipso facto, I guess is what you would say. Therefore, it all adds up. It proves the superiority of the race. So again, this leans very heavily on some of Darwin's ideas, but not actually his real ideas. It leans heavily in a very superficial way on Darwinism, on Darwinian evolution. The key word and the key phrase we should keep in mind when we talk about social Darwinism is survival of the fittest. So Darwin, I don't recall if Darwin actually used the term himself, but it was an interpretation of his work. Again, going back to the example of the finches, the ones with the longer beaks were able to feed and reproduce, therefore they survived. They were the fittest. The ones who couldn't, didn't, and they disappeared. They were not fit enough. So this is all being applied to humanity, the ones that were able to accumulate this kind of wealth, the racial and Western European societies that were able to rise to become these dominant European powers and kingdoms, including the United States, prove that they were fit enough to do this, to survive the external pressures, whereas these other societies, whether they are Chinese or Japanese or American Indian, were not. They did not survive. They could not rise to the occasion, and they certainly could not match wits or military might against Anglo-Saxon Protestant Western Europeans. If you recall in the earlier slide, paired with the natural selection chart, I had one half of this chart right here. And you can kind of see how this is all beginning to work together and how phrenology is partially involved. And you can't quite see how polygenesis is involved, since because it's actually anti-Darwin, but you can kind of get a sense of how that would work together here. I mean, you are looking at these statues of Greek men, these kind of great these great heroes of antiquity, of the Hellenistic period. The Hellenistic period would have been classical Greece, classical Rome. That's who we have up here. They have these nice, straight, rigid faces, obviously all light-skinned or lighter-skinned. And you can see that they're kind of borrowing from phrenology here with the shape of the skull and the way the skull is divided. It clearly suggests somebody of what they would have seen as higher breeding and a higher step on the evolutionary ladder. Below him, of course, you can see a very, very racially charged caricature of an African or a darker skinned individual whose facial features are not nearly as smooth or as delicate, clearly suggesting somebody without refinement is what they would be pushing. Look at the jawbone and head bone, for example. Notice how it's not particularly flat. And then look at the skull, the illustration of the skull right in front of him, and compare it to the one below, where you can see that they're really drawing a comparison here between people of this color and their facial shapes to apes, essentially, chimpanzees and monkeys. Therefore, in the mind of a social Darwinist, evolution certainly exists. That's something that a polygenesis wouldn't support, but they would agree that this particular person is superior to this particular person. But what a social Darwinist would do is they would say there is a natural evolutionary movement here, but we at the top are the ultimate expression of that evolutionary movement, whereas this gentleman below here is not nearly as high up on the ladder. He is closer to our chimpanzee brethren here than this gentleman here. Now, the reason why I still bring up polygenesis is because if you look at a lot of, if you were to listen to or read a lot of racist pieces by thinkers of the day, not necessarily academic thinkers, but people who are simply well educated and elite, maybe like a corporate executive or somebody who studies marketing at the time. We're talking in the late 1800s, early 1900s, 19 teens and 20s. You would still have people who would say that they don't have anything common. They don't have anything in common with these people because these people are more closely related to chimpanzees, and so that's still kind of a subtle belief that the races are separate and not unified, but they still have these social Darwinistic views of their society being superior evolutionary wise than everyone else. Then you have these academic social Darwinists who acknowledge that there is a connection, a lineage connection between these three groups. But again, that we as in white Europeans are at the highest level of this. We are at the pinnacle. I know it's a bit screwy to say that, but again, this is kind of a screwy science to talk about. Here are some interesting caricatures. On the right is Jim Crow, a popular depiction of a African American archetype. Jim Crow was kind of this lazy layabout character in minstrel shows that were very popular before and after the Civil War, often depicting white actors in blackface, and at times, believe it or not, even black actors in blackface. How a black actor or why a black actor would put on blackface might seem redundant to somebody, but it was simply to make their skin look darker in order to make their caricature and their features more exaggerated. And so Jim Crow was kind of this goofy gentleman who tried to act smarter and be smarter than what he really was, but he really wasn't, and he just came off as a buffoon. You also had other archetypes as well, such as Sambo, Pickaninny, and others. And these would have been very racially charged stereotypes that no doubt play off of what we see here and over here. You also have on the left, believe it or not, two Irishmen, which is disturbing to say the least. The Irishman on the right here is still lighter skinned because he just showed up from Ireland, and the Irishman on the left is all dark because he's just lazy and he's just inferior. It's important to point out that these types of archetypes and this view of race was also applied to other Europeans. The French were considered, even though the French were Catholic, they were considered up to the same scale mostly as the Anglo-Saxon Protestants. Even though they were Catholic, they were still of Frankish descent. And the Franks, like the Normans, were partially Germanic. And so they still counted. They may have still aligned themselves to a dictatorial type of religion and hadn't improved upon that yet. They were still racially in the same regard and culturally in the same regard, mostly as white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. But the Italians, the Greeks, the Spanish, they were darker skinned people. They were Catholic too, but they were darker skinned people. The Slavs of Eastern Europe, like the Russians and the Ukrainians, the Romanians and the Hungarians, and the Czechs, they were all Eastern Europeans, and they were not considered to be at the same level of our Anglo-Saxon Western European counterparts here. They were the highest echelon. The Irish are no different, even though the Irish technically come from Western Europe, because Ireland is in Western Europe. It is actually more west of Great Britain than Great Britain is. Great Britain is to the east of Ireland. Ireland is to the west of Great Britain. But the Irish were considered kind of untamed Gaelic people who were addicted to Catholicism. They were considered to be people who worshipped the Pope. They were dirty. They were filthy. They were backwards. They had absolutely no concept of economics and culture. And so they were considered to be inferior, considerably inferior. Actually, believe it or not, racially, throughout the 1850s, 1860s, and really up until about the 1880s, Irish were considered to be not even white. They were considered to be a lesser race. They were not white because to be white, air quote white, was to be white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, which the Irish were not. Now, that's not to say I want to go out on record right now and point out that the Irish were not slaves in the United States. That is a myth. The Irish were not slaves. When they came over, had their freedom, but they were significantly discriminated against because of their immigrant status, because of the stereotypes applied to the Irish, that they had a lot of children, that they drank a lot, they didn't work, they stole jobs, which I don't know how those two went together, that they didn't work and they stole jobs, but that they were unruly, they were addicted to Catholicism, and so on and so forth. But they were not slaves. I just want to go on record to say that. But as you can see here, they were depicted in many ways as being very similar to what we have over here in the Jim Crow, which is essentially somebody who was lesser than our white Anglo-Saxon overlords, as they would say. I want you to watch this clip from The Great Gatsby. I imagine most of you were probably required to read The Great Gatsby when you were in high school, at least I was. And during that time, you may have seen the movie. There are several versions of the movie. This clip is taken directly from the 1976, 74, the one in the 70s with Robert Redford. This clip is taken from that movie. Now, the most recent version in 2013 has this clip out as well, and it actually looks a lot better because the person actually uploaded the clip directly, whereas what you're about to see is simply somebody recording their own television set, which I absolutely hate. But the version from the 2013 film, it's shortened. They have a lot of the character Tom Buchanan, who's the character here. He's an adulterer, an abuser of his spouse, and a racist. So they pulled out all the stops to make him look like a bad guy. He delivers a fairly interesting line about race and about intellectual social Darwinism, but they cut some of it in the 2013 movie, whereas this one keeps most of it. So I chose to go with this version. You'll note that Tom Buchanan talks about a book called The Rise of the Colored Empire, and talks about a man named Goddard. He's actually referring to the rising tide of color against white supremacy, which is part of our readings this week. We have 2 excerpts out of it. Now, I'm not entirely certain if F. Scott Fitzgerald made Tom Buchanan say the wrong title and the wrong name because he wanted to make Tom look like he didn't fully understand everything, or if F. Scott Fitzgerald didn't want to get sued by Stoddard because Stoddard was still alive when The Great Gatsby was written. But that's really neither here nor there. Take a moment, pause this video, watch the clip, and then turn the video back on when you are done. Okay, now that you've watched the video, you get a sense of where Tom Buchanan is coming from here, and that really is a nice, tidy way of kind of summing up the views of social Darwinists. Tom Buchanan is a stockbroker. He is not an intellectual in the traditional sense. He's not an academic. He's not like Louis Agassiz, and he's not like other intellectuals of the time. But he is considered a Harvard man. He went to Harvard. I think it was Harvard. He went to Harvard or Princeton. He was Ivy League educated. He is somebody who earned a degree. He is considered to be an elite of his class. This kind of stockbroker, makes a lot of money, who casually reads the literature of the day. And you can see his views here. The Nordic race. The Nordics are Teutonic, Aryan, Anglo-Saxon. They're the Northern Europeans, especially the blonde-haired, blue-eyed ones. You can, if you know anything about Hitler, you can see where we're going to be going with this. They are the ones who sit atop of the world because of art, because of literature, because of music, and their contributions to the world, and their ability to control the world. That's what makes them top. But then he also notes the caution of all these other lesser people, air quotes, lesser people, these inferior people, these barbarians who are not able to be governed, who need to be governed strongly by a white race, are beginning to rise up and try to overthrow them. And perhaps, if we're not very careful, they will. And so that is Tom Buchanan's view of the world. And he's getting this from this man he refers to as Goddard, but this is Stoddard's view. And you're going to get this when you read the two excerpts, which one is the preface by Stoddard himself, and the other one is an introduction by Madison Grant, who was writing the intro on behalf of his friend Stoddard. So that is a very nice, tidy way of describing the mentality of a social Darwinist. The rising tide of color, like I said, this is what we're looking at. This cover really says it all. I mean, look what we have depicted here. We have not only people who are clearly not white, but we have people here depicted in very frightening and stereotypical ways. We have the African, no doubt, stretching across from Africa into Europe. We have what's clearly somebody who's Asian, Chinese, or Vietnamese, armed to the teeth, stretching out from Asia towards Europe as well. Don't know who this gentleman is back here. This could be a European because he's armed with a rifle, or maybe it could possibly be an Eastern European because they were armed with weapons, but they were also considered to be inferior, and they're coming for you as well. So you can see how this really kind of plays on paranoia as well as a superior mentality. Turning our attention broadly back to the United States, this type of thinking also has roots in the nativist movement. The nativist movement has existed as long as the United States has existed, this fear of outsiders, this fear of foreigners. But it's mainly dominant in the 19th century and early 20th century during our time period. It's very prevalent before the Civil War and all the way up really until, I mean, you could argue it's still prevalent today, but for our purposes, it's very much prevalent from before the Civil War, say 1820s, all the way up through, say, 1945 to the end of our period. What nativists believe was that white Anglo-Saxon Protestants were destined to control the United States. They saw the United States as a white man's land, and by white men, again, white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. And they saw immigrants in particular as being very dangerous to the character of the United States. They believed that we were letting too many people in. The Irish Catholics were awful to let into this country because they're Catholic. They're dirty, they're filthy, they're drunkards, they take jobs, and they reproduce. The stereotype about the Irish was all they do is have children. And so you'll have these Irish families of 20 or 30 kids. That's an exaggeration, but how can a Protestant family compete with that? And the fear is pretty soon they're going to outnumber us and seize control of the country. This was also applied to the Scottish, but not to the same degree because the Scottish were Protestant, and you had a group of people called the Scotch Irish who were Protestant and more or less welcome in this country. You also had the fear of Chinese people and Asian people, especially on the West Coast. And so there were fears that they would come and take jobs and sell women into prostitution and deal in drugs and spread disease. So this is all part of nativism. And it goes back to this belief that the United States, in particular, in this example, is destined to be a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant land. Uh, in Britain, they're not so much fearful of immigration because nobody really is immigrating to Britain in that sense. But they also share a number of these beliefs too, that white Anglo-Saxon Protestants have to defend their borders, they have to defend themselves, they have to control these other lesser peoples lest they get the better of them. In the United States, it's a little bit more dynamic because the United States has so many different kinds of people living there, including African Americans. Now, the African Americans are given something of a pass in this regard because they were already here, brought over to do labor. And a lot of African Americans are Protestant. Now, while there are a lot of African Americans who are Catholic, a lot of them are Protestant. And so they are definitely on the lower end of the pyramid, but they're not looked at with the same degree of paranoia as these incoming Irish who are going to take over the world and align this country with the Pope. So, again, these are all part. So a social Darwinist like Tom Buchanan is absolutely frightened of these lesser people, these other people who are coming into this world and trying to subvert the white Anglo-Saxon elite Protestant control of it. That control, which, by the way, just to reiterate, is what made countries like Great Britain and Germany and the United States into great countries. So this is an attack, an invasion upon this way of life. Here's a great pyramid that kind of illustrates this. I did borrow this from another person who was teaching a class, but it really kind of shows you the way social Darwinism is applied. It is not simply the races and ethnicities of the world, but in the United States in particular, it also can be broken down by immigrant status. But immigrant status also reflects those racial and ethnic barriers too. So you have African Americans on the bottom. They are Black, they are dark skinned, they are at the lowest of this pyramid. Asians and Asians and Latinos and Native Americans are not nearly as dark, and they have, according to them, certain characteristics that make them superior to African Americans, but inferior to the rest of European society. New immigrants, air quotes, new immigrants, are immigrants that come from Southern and Eastern Europe, Italians, Greeks, Spanish, Slavs, the Poles, the Russians. They're definitely higher than the other two. Jews, they're definitely higher than the other two, but they are not as high up as Western Europeans. Now, notice the Western Europeans are the old immigrants, but notice the Irish kind of have their own line. They're not quite white, but they're close, but they're not. You could look at the Irish as being the lowest whites on the totem pole in terms of Western European status, because the Slavs and the Jews and them are not considered white, not at this time. Old immigrants like the Scots, the English, the French, people like that. Sometimes the Spanish are considered this if they're light-skinned Spanish. They would go in this area. They're Catholic, they're newcomers, but they're from the old countries. They're the Dutch. They're from the old countries that came over and mostly share our values. Then you have those poor white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, the ones who do a little bit better, and of course the wealthy elites on top. This is the way the world is viewed by a social Darwinist, especially in the United States. For a social Darwinist in Europe, they probably view the world in the same way, but again, they don't necessarily think much in terms of immigration because they don't deal with immigration in the same way. They in Europe, they have a habit of casting people out more so than taking people in at this time. So immigration wouldn't be a major deal with them, although, as we see later on next week, European countries, including the United States, will be exerting their influence and power around the globe in places like India, China, and Japan. And you're definitely going to see them incorporate these races that are part of their empire into such a pyramid as to who is superior and who is inferior. This is a clip from the movie Gangs of New York. I'm really kind of hitting Leonardo DiCaprio a lot today because he was in the clip from Django Unchained. He is not in this version of The Great Gatsby, but he was in the 2013 version, so I do mention that movie offhand. And he is in this movie from 2002, directed by Martin Scorsese. Now, the movie takes place in the 1850s and 1860s, and it concerns the Irish. Of course, this is the United States. But I like this clip because one of the characters, played by Daniel Day-Lewis, you can't miss him when he starts talking. He is a native, quote, native-born American, a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. He's a butcher, so he's not an elite, but he owns a butcher shop. He has a lot of influence. He's like a local elite. He would be considered at the time, I guess you'd say, middle class for his period. And he absolutely despises the Irish and the Catholics, and he definitely doesn't seem to hold African Americans in a high regard either. So this video clip actually has a lot of interesting things to say. And while social Darwinism was not a concept at the time that this movie is supposed to take place during the Civil War, you can get a sense again of how a social Darwinist would view things like immigration, these different people coming over, and the danger you have coming from these people invading your lands and the danger they pose towards white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. So I'm making this clip optional because Daniel Day-Lewis's character does use some profane language, and I do warn you about language I'm not going to repeat. So I am making this optional because you're not really going to miss anything if you skip the clip, but it is helpful if you do watch it. So take a moment and watch the clip, and we will move on to our next section, which will be on economics. And after economics, we'll have one more section on eugenics, and then I will end with a small preview of next week's lecture. My thing isn't working. Here we go.